10 years had passed since the empire of Larul fell to the Sienna Ball, a rudderless alien race spread across 2 star systems. The Sienna Balls stood tall, a little over 6 feet with old copper skin and completely bald heads. They wore armored plates over leather garments, and their weapon of choice was the dual-barrel plasma rifle. The Empire of Larul had been one of the oldest civilizations in the sector before their defeat. They were technologically advanced in medicine, engineering, and agriculture, and their ships had once traveled everywhere. Now, no trace of them can be found. To understand what happened in this galaxy, one needed to know the history. Earth had been destroyed cycles ago, leaving only a few humans behind. Among them was Lee, just plain Lee, a human without a world to call home. In a dark debris field, Lee sat in the cockpit of a small ship that he had built with hope and duct tape, or that's what he said. Outside, a Sienna Ball patrol cruiser passed by the field, scanning slowly for targets. He kept his ship hidden between the remains of 2 destroyed cargo haulers. Thinking of a species that controlled this sector, the Sienna Ball really needed better equipment. He picked up their signatures the day before and was waiting for the patrol to move on. According to galaxy rumors, a few humans live at Vitali Station. He was trying to get there pronto. He had been alone for a long time and had its advantages, but hearing another human voice would be better. He decided to scan ahead and see if that Sienna Ball ship had left the sector. He hoped it would be clear, as it was starting to get cold in the ship. He asked in a shaky voice, "Computer, scan sector ahead." The navigation computer responded, "No vessels within range." Lee said in a very optimistic tone, "Well then, let's plot a course to Vitali Station." It took 3 days of slipping past Sienna Ball patrols for Lee to reach Vitali Station, but he finally arrived. The station was a giant mess of space architecture, a chaotic assembly of patched hulls, crooked docking arms, and old lights hanging off every side. Every species running from Sienna Ball oppression seemed to end up there sooner or later. Lee needed fuel, supplies, and a hot meal. He made a mental note that his ship was docked on landing pad 7. You never know when you might have to leave in a hurry. Looking around the station, he managed to find a place that made some type of meat shish kebab. He sat down, scanning the area to make sure it was a safe place to eat, thinking there was nothing wrong with being careful. A server moved toward his table, holding a different tray in each of her 4 arms, and asked, "What can I get you?" Lee asked, suspiciously, "I know I'm not supposed to ask, but what kind of meat is that?" The server looked at him with confusion and said, "You don't want to know. For all I know, that could be space rats." Lee looked at her, amused by how serious she was, before she began laughing hysterically and added, "I'm just kidding. It's processed meat, and it's really good." Lee smiled, placing his order. "I'll take one, but can you tell me if there are any humans on this station?" She thought about the question for a bit, then replied, "There are no humans on this station." She walked away to put his order in. A few minutes later, she came back with his meal. The meat smelled delicious. She also set down a shot of some kind of alcohol. Looking at the cup, Lee said, "Sorry, but I didn't order that." She smiled and pointed toward a table 4 rows to his left, where 2 hooded figures sat. Lee took the shot out of courtesy and raised the cup toward them. They, in turn, did the same toward him. He couldn't see their faces due to the poor lighting and the fact that they were wearing hoods to stay concealed. He was in the middle of his meal when 4 Sienna Ball soldiers entered and approached the bar area, speaking to the alien behind it. They kept looking at Lee, so he tensed. They approached his table, and one of them asked in a demanding tone, "Is that your ship docked on landing pad 7? Lee continued to eat, hoping that his silence would make them go away. Another soldier grabbed his table and flipped it over, spilling his food everywhere. Lee stared at them and said, "Why did you have to do that? You know, we humans have a saying, 'Don't mess with our food.'" Lee struck one of the soldiers hard, right on his ugly nose, sending him spinning into another soldier. One of the hooded figures jumped, swinging a blue sword and cutting off one of the soldier's arms in a single pass. Moving with precise strikes, the figure took down all 4 soldiers without spilling a drop of blood. The figure was standing a few feet from Lee. and that was when he noticed she was a female warrior. He swore he heard her sword sing. She was about 5 feet tall, with skin as white as snow, completely blue eyes, and crimson-red hair. She wore gold armor, which looked more like an armored suit that fit her body. Lee had never seen such craftsmanship. The other figure stood up and spoke in a language Lee had never heard before. Melsat Argu Loti, Doset. Lee's translator instantly picked it up, rendering the words into galactic common. Put your sword away, Doset. The female warrior bowed her head as she sheathed the sword. The place went completely quiet as everyone stared at the 4 sienna ball bodies on the floor. The other hooded female walked toward Lee. In galactic common, she said, "We need to go, human. This place is not safe." Lee followed them quickly, reaching landing pad 7. "Is that your ship?" the older female asked. Lee nodded without thinking about it. "Can we board your ship?" she asked softly. Lee lowered his head a little and said, very humbly, "Go ahead." They departed the station without setting a destination, which felt like the safest thing to do. During the flight, the older female kept staring at Lee like he owed her something, until she finally broke the silence. The older female questioned him directly. "You were going to fight 4 Sienna Ball soldiers on your own? They could have killed you." Lee replied honestly, "Well, here's the thing. I was enjoying my food, and they didn't let me finish. If I lose my life, it will mark the end of my species." She looked at him for a moment and introduced themselves. "My name is Vivek, and this is First Arm Dosei. We are from the Kingdom of Larul." Looking over at Dosei, who stood quietly with her arms behind her back, Lee asked, "Wait, wasn't the Larul Empire wiped out by the Sienna Ball?" Vivek explained the situation in detail. "Our homeworld no longer exists, and some of us escaped into exile. I was first armed to the Queen and King when Larul was attacked, but I failed to protect them. The Queen died in my arms, and I was left for dead until Doset found me. Now we are looking for the Master of Arms, as he is the only one who possesses the secret of forging the blue sword." Lee offered his help, saying, "Do you know the Master of Arms' location? I have nothing else to do anyway." Vivek replied with concern, "We do. The thing is, he is my husband and a drunk. 1 cycle ago we approached him, but he didn't want anything to do with me." Lee tried to be supportive of what she told him, but he had to admit to himself, this situation was completely ate the hell up. Vivek added a final detail. "He is on the Vagone mining planet." Lee said with a smile, "Okay, Vagone planet it is." The Vagone mining planet was a giant industrial hub floating in the dark. As they entered the atmosphere, the ship's view screen filled with thick orange dust as they passed the silhouettes of massive drilling rigs. Lee guided his ship toward a dusty landing strip set between 2 towering weapon stations. If a legendary weapons master wanted to hide from the rest of the galaxy, he had picked the perfect place to do it. They exited and walked to the administration office, where they obtained a 72-hour pass. Vivek headed straight for the cantina, like a guided missile locked on a target. Lee was about to follow her when Doset put her hand on his chest, stopping him. Knowing the situation was volatile, she warned him. "Some matters are best left between 2 people." Vivek tapped the male figure on the shoulder. As he turned, she punched him so hard that Lee heard the echo move through the entire cantina. Wobbling around, the man tried to figure out what type of ship had hit him. Vivek grabbed him and said, "Now you have my attention, Rascal." They sat at a table far from the main door, overlooking the entrance. Doset signaled to Lee that it was safe to sit with them. Vivek looked at Rascal, angry but not mad. Slurring his words, Rascal asked, "What do you want, woman?" Vivek took a deep breath and said, "We need you. Without you, we don't have a chance to avenge our people." Rascal closed his eyes, rubbed his head slowly, and asked, "Have you ever wondered why we lost, Your Majesty?" Lee got up and walked to the counter. By some luck, the place had coffee. Lots of workers drank it to stay awake during mining operations, but it was synthetic, not the real thing. Lee brought a cup back to Rascal to help him sober up. It was at that exact moment he realized Rascal had just called Vivek, "Your Majesty." Lee looked at Vivek and asked stupidly, "I thought you said the Queen died in your arms." Vivek looked at him and explained, "She did. When a queen doesn't have an heir for succession, in our culture, the first arm is next in the succession line." Lee looked at Dosei with confusion. Understanding his curiosity, Vivek explained softly, "Doset became first arm when she accepted my sword. At that moment, she vowed to protect me with her life." Lee was incredibly impressed with these aliens. It felt exactly like reading an old sci-fi novel from Earth's early days. Knowing that free information was knowledge, after all, he asked another stupid question. "Is Raskal the king?" Vivek smiled and answered honestly, "No, but he is my king." Raskal looked at Vivek with eyes that seemed to find their way home. He set his cup down and said, "I'm good now. I'm ready to go." They walked back to the landing pad with Raskal beside them. He was still moving a bit slowly, but the haze in his eyes was completely gone. Vivek walked right beside him, her shoulders straight, looking every bit like the ruler she was. They boarded the ship, and Lee asked for their next destination. Instead of giving him coordinates, Dosei pulled a document from her armor and handed it to him. As he opened it, the three of them watched him patiently. Lee read the text out loud. "As the stars set every day, I will set myself bright with life. I will listen to the wisdom of the elders and protect those who cannot protect themselves. I will follow the judgment of my queen, but I will also advise on that judgment with a true heart." After Lee finished reading it, Vivek looked him dead in the eyes. "You cannot continue with us unless you are fully committed to my people and my kingdom. I know you don't have a home or a family, but this I can give to you, Lee of Larul." Lee didn't know how to answer such a request. "I'm just human, Your Majesty." Vivek gave him a soft smile. "Rascal asked me earlier, why did we lose? We lost because we didn't have what humans have. Humanity. You didn't ask who we were. You didn't oppose us boarding your ship, and you willingly helped us. That is why we lost. It was written in our own oath, and we ignored it. You are what my people need. You are what I need on my side, along with Doset and Raskal." Lee was silent for a moment, thinking. He didn't have anything to lose. Looking at all of them, Lee declared, "Your Majesty, where you go, I will go." For the first time as she looked at Lee, Dosei smiled. Lee asked, "Destination, please?" Sounding more alive now that Vivek was rubbing his hair, Raskal answered, "Planet Urigala." On the way to the planet Urigala, Raskal explained that the planet was under Cienabal occupation, meaning they could not just land willy-nilly. Urigala was the only place in the galaxy where they could get a star igniter. They needed it to generate a fire hot enough to forge blades from a specific asteroid rock, a process that turned the metal completely blue and made the swords indestructible. Lee suggested, "You guys can't land there, but I can. The only problem is I don't know what a star igniter looks like." Raskal tried to explain what it looked like without success, finally sighing, "I will go." But the queen objected to the idea, since he was the only one who knew the forging process. Doset said proudly, "I will go with Lee, Your Majesty. My job is not only to protect you, but also to protect Lee, since he is family." Raskal smiled and teased them. "You guys can easily pass as a married couple." Vivek smiled back, looking at her warrior and pointing out, "You can't go down there wearing armor, Doset." Lee offered her some of his extra clothes. After she finished changing and stepped out, his heart completely skipped a beat. He had never seen such beauty in his life. Dosei asked, "Why are you guys staring?" Vivek and Raskal smiled and answered together, "You guys look adorable together." Doset's face turned completely red, and Lee quickly focused back on the controls. He still needed to find a safe place to drop Vivek and Raskal off before they headed into the danger zone. After they dropped off the royal couple, they set a course for Urigala. The journey was quiet until Dosei asked him about Earth. It took Lee a moment to answer her. Earth was destroyed when the moon lost its orbit, causing the planet to destabilize. Without the moon's rotation, the planet went completely banana crazy. A few survivors made it off-world, and I was born among them. But over time, my people's short lifespan took a toll on the remaining survivors. Doset listened without interruption, looking out the viewport. Then she turned to Lee and vowed, "I will be by your side during your lifespan, I promise." Lee stayed quiet, but deep inside he felt relieved. He wasn't alone anymore. The landing gear hissed as they touched down in the heart of Urigala's commercial sector. The place was completely chaotic, packed with aliens shouting, trading, and pushing through the crowd. Dosette made sure her hair was covered so they could avoid unnecessary attention. Lee asked, "Where are we going?" She motioned for him to follow her. Lee would have done that even if she hadn't asked him to. They entered a store called Sparks, which made Lee laugh because of the sheer irony. Lee walked toward the shop owner. Just as he was about to ask for the igniter, Dosette pulled him aside and whispered, "We don't ask. It draws attention. We find it." Lee walked around the shop until he saw something that looked exactly like a human lighter. Looking at the small device, he said to himself, "Nah, that can't be it." He grabbed it anyway. That was when he noticed two Sienna Ball soldiers were about to grab Dosette from behind. Lee screamed at her as loud as he could. She turned and ran toward him. Lee pressed a tiny button on an object that looked like a lighter. A tiny spark came out and landed a few feet away from him. Dosette grabbed his arm, pulling him hard and screaming, "Run!" The spark instantly ignited into a massive firestorm, consuming everything in sight. They scrambled back onto the ship and hauled ass away from the planet. They picked up Vivek and Raskal and got back on course. With the ship on autopilot, Vivek and Raskal stayed quiet for a moment. Lee handed Raskal the igniter, but they kept looking at him and Dosette funny. Vivek asked, "Did anything happen down there that we need to know about?" Dosette and Lee both shook their heads with a firm no. Then Vivek and Raskal started laughing hysterically. Lee had no idea why until Vivek pulled out a mirror and they saw their faces. They looked exactly like two boiled lobsters. Their faces were still burning when the autopilot dropped them out of hyperspace. Ahead of the ship lay a hidden asteroid belt, thick and dark, completely invisible to the Sienna Ball sensors. Raskal took the pilot's seat, guiding the ship deep into the hollowed-out core of a massive rock. They landed in an ancient bay with minimal light. Raskal looked worried about what he was about to tell them. Raskal said, "When our empire flourished, we ran 3 operational forges. We forged magnificent swords that cut through the strongest steel. The Sienna Ball destroyed 2 forges during the war. They could not find this one, the oldest." Vivek said softly, "Raskal, there is something you need to know. I moved what remains of our people here." Raskal replied, "I don't have a problem with that, Your Majesty. After all, this place is big enough for everyone." They exited the ship to find Elder Morel and Elder Tressa waiting patiently. Elder Morel spoke first. "Your Majesty, you have returned with the Master of Arms." He then looked at Lee with curiosity. Elder Tressa, pointing a finger at Lee, asked, "Who is this? What species is he?" Vivek answered, "He is Lee of Larul, and he will stay with us." Lee interrupted proudly, "I am human." Morel replied in an annoying tone, "A human, Your Majesty." Vivek rolled her eyes, getting ready to unleash on the elder. Stepping forward, she warned him, "You need to think hard and watch your tongue before you say something you may regret to a member of my family." Both elders bowed their heads and apologized immediately. Everyone gathered in the main hall. Lee looked around the space and realized it felt less like an ancient forge and more like a palace. If this place looked that good, their actual home planet must have been breathtaking before the war. Vivek walked up with Dosette to a raised stone platform, where Dosette positioned herself to her right. Raskal stood just a half step behind her. Over 1,000 Larul survivors filled the floor. Vivek raised her right hand, bringing an immediate quietness to the place. "My people, my friends, and my family," Vivek said, her voice echoing perfectly off the high walls. "I did what I promised you. We brought back the Master of Arms, and we have the Star Igniter." A low murmur ran through the crowd. Some looked hopeful, while others looked right at Lee with deep suspicion. Vivek looked straight toward Lee with a soft, warm smile. "Some of you are curious about the human," she said. She descended the steps, walking along the path that opened in the crowd. Stopping right beside Lee, she placed her hand on his shoulder and continued. He is the last of a rare species which I learned to love as one of mine. Among our people you cannot find such humbleness. He is mine to keep." A few days later in the forge, Raskal stepped away from the anvil and turned to face Lee. Looking toward the blazing heat, he gave a polite nod and spoke respectfully. "I appreciate everything you did to get this igniter, but I must ask you to step outside now. Our forge doors must be closed to preserve the secrets of forging the blades." Lee stepped back with a smile. "No problem at all, my friend." The doors slid shut behind him, sealing Raskal inside with his workers. Lee turned around and realized he hadn't noticed Dosette was right behind him, looking so pretty in the dim hallway light. She caught his eye and smiled. "Come on, I will show you the garden." Lee followed her deep into the structure until they stepped out into the most amazing garden he had ever seen. Of course, he had never actually seen a real one before, only pictures in old Earth archives. He spun around, looking everywhere at the perfectly settled stone pathways, the small wooden bridges, and the trees. Lee asked aloud in sheer wonder, "Wait a minute! What kind of irony is this?" Dosette stopped walking, looking just as confused as Lee was. Lee shook his head in complete disbelief. "This looks exactly like an ancient Japanese garden." Dosette struggled with the pronunciation. "Japa Japa?" It was easily the cutest thing to happen in this garden. Lee smiled at her and said, "Never mind." Raskal spent close to 17 days in isolation. He worked day and night, sometimes even missing meals. He stopped drinking entirely. For Lee, that was an incredible accomplishment. During that time, Raskal forged 2 identical swords, but they were different from the regular Larul warriors' swords. He presented them to Vivek and the elders in the main hall. One of the elders questioned him directly. "Why 2 swords and why identical, Master of Arms?" Raskal answered, "Because they're meant to be for 2 warriors who together are one." Some of the elders remained confused. Some murmured that Raskal had gone mad, and they even went so far as to say he was drunk. Raskal stayed quiet as Vivek raised her hand to quiet everyone. Vivek asked politely, "Please bring Lee in, Dosette." Lee entered the hall with Dosette at his side. Raskal looked right at Dosette and commanded, "Relinquish your sword, First Arm Dosette." Dosette, without hesitation, gave Raskal the sword. Lee instantly tensed up, thinking Dosette was in some kind of trouble. Instead, Vivek stepped forward, grabbed one of the brand-new swords, and presented it to Dosette. Vivek told Dosette softly, "This is a new pact between you and me, First Arm." Dosette looked at the sword, completely confused. "I already have your sword, Your Majesty." Raskal looked up and replied, "Yes, but you must return it. You must understand Vivek is a queen, but she is also a warrior, and a warrior without a weapon is just a person." Dosette bowed her head, accepting the new sword. As she placed her hands on the weapon, nothing happened. Raskal gave Vivek the second identical sword. Vivek stepped in front of Lee and held it out, speaking warmly. "This is for you, Commander Lee, as a gesture of friendship, love, and family." Lee looked at the beautiful blade, feeling a deep weight in his chest. He admitted with sadness, "I'm not a warrior, Your Majesty." Her eyes locked onto his, and Vivek questioned him calmly. "Why are you looking so sad? In our culture, warriors are made through training, but a rare few are born warriors. You are one of those rare warriors." Lee hesitated for a second, then reached out and took the sword. The moment he grabbed the sword, something completely unexplainable happened. The hum of his blade suddenly shifted pitch, and across from him, Dosette's blade did the exact same thing. The 2 separate sounds melted into one perfect chord, echoing through the massive hall. Both blades harmonized, vibrating in their hands as if they shared a single heartbeat. Everyone in the hall stood frozen, completely silenced by the song of the twin swords. The elders had never witnessed such an event. Completely astonished, they bowed their heads in acceptance. The swords did not lie. A week later, the open space of the ancient training ground did not feel very peaceful anymore. Dosette stood across from Lee, her sword drawn, looking incredibly sharp and focused. Lee was completely out of his depth. Dosette shifted into a perfect combat stance and challenged him. "Attack me, Commander!" Lee took a clumsy step forward and swung the blade like a baseball bat. Dosette moved like water, easily sidestepping his move and tapping the flat of her blade against his shoulder. Her eyes narrowed as she commanded, "Again!" Lee was having problems learning a single thing. Dosette let out a loud, heavy sigh, her jaw tightening as she dropped her guard. She looked completely frustrated with his absolute lack of technique. Vivek watched with an amused smile as Dosette lost her cool. Stepping onto the training floor, Vivek intervened. "Dosette, a word, please. Lee, take a break, please." Lee nodded and sat down on a smooth bench at the edge of the floor. Vivek and Dosette spoke quietly for a few minutes near the weapon racks. When they finished, Dosette returned to Lee, her expression completely blank. Looking directly into his eyes, Dosette told him, "I will no longer be training you." Before Lee could even open his mouth, Dosette turned and left the training ground without saying another word. Lee got up and approached Vivek. Lee asked, "What happened?" Vivek replied calmly, "Commander, you will not learn anything from Dosette." Completely baffled, Lee said, "Your Majesty, Dosette is the most proficient combat expert I have ever known." Vivek countered, "Yes, but you still won't learn from her." Throwing his hands up, Lee said out loud, "I am confused." Vivek stayed quiet, but a voice spoke from the entrance. Raskal leaned against the doorframe, shaking his head as he said, "You are in love, fool! That's why you can't learn from her!" Lee stood there, his mouth open, completely unable to say anything. Vivek smiled warmly at his stunned face and offered, "I will train you myself." The training with the Queen became a political nightmare. The elders were furious because their law only allowed the Queen to train one person, the first arm. To stop the madness, Vivek got everyone together in the grand hall. Vivek declared to the shocked assembly, "I have decided to change our custom and have two first arms. Dosette is still first in the succession line, and that will not change. But she doesn't have to be alone." This revelation made sense to the elders, who unanimously accepted it. It took Lee close to 3 years to learn to the point where he was actually good. Throughout all that time, Dosette kept her promise to him and stayed right by his side. And today, Her Majesty Queen Vivek finally gave the order. Her voice echoing with pride, Vivek commanded, "Send the beacon, announce to the galaxy that we are back." The Laurel beacon had barely dissolved into the void when a single Sienna Ball shuttle detached from the battle cruiser and headed straight for the asteroid bay. The Sienna Ball were too arrogant to believe a fallen empire could pose a real threat, choosing instead to send a diplomatic envoy to intimidate Laurel. The main reception hall of the Forge was transformed into a royal court. Vivek sat on an elegant high-backed chair, her posture completely flawless. Dosette stood at her right hand, her fingers resting lightly on the hilt of her sword. Lee stood directly at the Queen's left side, wearing a brand-new suit of armor specially designed by Raskal and adorned with old Earth colors. Vivek did not want Lee to lose his heritage. The doors slid open as the Sienna Ball envoy marched into the hall, flanked by 10 armed soldiers carrying dual-barrel plasma rifles. They moved in a tight formation, their armored plates clanking loudly as they walked. The envoy stopped at the base of the platform, looking up at Vivek with a sneer. The envoy spoke in a booming, condescending voice. "You triggered a beacon and think you can reclaim this sector, woman? Look around you. Your empire is dust, and we have enough firepower in orbit to turn this rock into pebbles." Vivek did not even flinch at the threat. She looked down at the envoy with cold eyes and said calmly, "You speak of power, yet you come into my domain with armed soldiers to protect you. You are a long way from home, Sienna Ball." The envoy gestured toward his armored soldiers, trying to look imposing. Before the soldiers could even reach for their weapons, Dosette and Lee moved like a storm with fury. The envoy saw a flash of blue light moving. When his eyes finally adjusted, the swords from Lee and Dosette were inches from his neck, making a deadly, steady sound. Vivek gave the envoy a creepy smile and said ruthlessly, "Tell your soldiers to lower their weapons, or your head goes." The envoy raised his hand slowly, looking at the glowing blue edges of the blades. He gasped in a terrified whisper, "I think there has been a misunderstanding, Your Majesty." The soldiers stood completely still, staring at their leader. Vivek looked at her two warriors and commanded sharply, "Doset, Lee, reposition." Both warriors stepped back fluidly, returning to Vivek's side without breaking their focus. The hum of their swords faded back into a low, deadly vibration. Vivek leaned forward in her elegant chair, locking her eyes directly onto the trembling sienna ball. Vivek declared in a cold, final tone, "Listen, we don't want an empire, but I will make this clear. We are not making the same mistakes as before." The envoy's smile and arrogant attitude vanished instantly. Sweat dripping down his copper skin, he asked nervously, "What do you want, Your Majesty?" Vivek laid out her conditions without hesitating. "First, if any of my people are in chains, you will release them immediately. Second, you will give them safe passage to come home. That's all." The envoy's eyes darted toward the exit, his confidence starting to creep back into his voice as he questioned, "And if we don't?" Vivek paused for a few seconds, looking at the envoy, and warned, "I suggest you reach your cruiser right now, so you can get my point." The envoy raised his arm and signaled one of his soldiers to activate their communication link to reach the cruiser in orbit. Instead, a Larul military officer's voice answered loudly through the radio frequency. "We are retaining your vessel temporarily until our queen finishes her petition." The envoy stood completely speechless, realizing he had just lost his leverage. Shaking to his core, he hesitated. "Your Majesty, we need time." Vivek leaned forward, her glare cold and absolute. "No more time. When the beacon was activated, your time had expired. We don't want war, but don't take me for a fool. If these conditions are not met by the time you reach your ship, I will unleash hell across this galaxy for my people." The envoy nodded in complete understanding, his copper skin turning pale as he swallowed his pride. He left with his head still attached. True to the envoy's terrified promise, the Sienna Ball chose compliance over total destruction. Within 2 days, 3 massive Sienna Ball transports arrived at the asteroid belt to return the prisoners. Hundreds of Larul prisoners stepped off the transport ships. They had been pulled from slave labor camps, deep space mining rigs, and planetary prisons across 2 star systems. They looked weary, but as they stepped onto the forge, they did not see a hidden resistance. They saw Larul warriors in their golden armor receiving them. The Sienna Ball crew members on the transport looked terrified. Realizing the fallen empire was no longer helpless, they saw that Larul looked more powerful than ever before. Vivek and Raskal walked down to the hangar floor, escorted by Lee and Dosei, whose reputations as master swordsmen had spread through the returning Larul prisoners. As the prisoners recognized their queen standing tall, the entire hangar fell into a stunned silence. Then, one by one, they bowed their heads in quiet reverence. A few hours later, the Sienna Ball commander's voice came through from the battlecruiser at the edge of the system, stripped of its arrogance. "The terms are fulfilled, Queen Vivek. Every Larul prisoner in our territory has been returned safely." Vivek looked up at the screen with cold, calculating eyes, and answered firmly, "As long as my people remain free and peace remains between us, there will be no war. But remember this day, Sienna Ball. If you step over our line, we will unleash a fire you cannot extinguish." The communication line went dead instantly as the Sienna Ball fleet turned around and jumped into hyperspace, fleeing the system entirely. The main hangar had finally grown quiet, but Lee felt a gentle tug on his sleeve. He turned to find Dosei gesturing toward the exit. Smiling quietly, the two of them slipped away and walked back down the stone corridors, heading deep into the structure until they reached the ancient garden. The quiet sound of trickling water and the soft rustle of alien trees welcomed them. They walked across the small wooden bridge together and stopped at the center, looking out over the perfectly settled stone pathways. The dim light caught the polished hilts of their identical twin swords, resting side by side at their waists. Lee looked down at her and broke the silence with a soft smile. "Well, Dosei, 3 years of training later, and I finally know how to swing this thing. Though I still think your people got the blueprint for this garden straight out of an old Earth archive." Dosette let out a soft, beautiful laugh and corrected her earlier mistake perfectly. "It is a Japanese garden. I practiced the word." Lee laughed, his chest feeling lighter than it had in years. Dosette stepped closer to him, her eyes locking onto his with absolute warmth. She reached out, gently placing her hand over his heart, and vowed softly, "Your short human lifespan does not make your life lesser, Lee. It makes every single moment with you precious." Lee placed his hand over hers, his fingers interlocking with hers as he smiled. "You are mine to keep." Dosette rested her head against his shoulder, her voice filled with pure happiness. "Always." Behind them, Vivek and Rascal smiled, saying, "Our kids are adorable together." Lee and Dosette replied together, "We heard that." Lee and Dosette became beloved by the people of the kingdom. Together they lived a life full of happiness with their 4 children. Dosette stayed with Lee until his passing at the age of 103. When he passed, Vivek wept for her beloved son.